Hello, today I'll provide an update on the work Fisheries and Oceans Canada is doing since last year's Ropeless Consortium meeting to develop a strategy that will encompass both on-demand gear and low breaking strength gear in Canadian fisheries. This past July, we distributed a proposed strategy to a few hundred partners in the Canadian fishing industry, as well as researchers, NGOs, First Nations, and other expert groups for their input. I'll talk more about the related engagement process a little later. DFO's draft whale safe gear strategy has a high-level ambitious goal, presenting a vision that balances the protection of whales with support for sustainable fisheries and the communities that rely on them. I would like to note that this goal will also need to reflect certain non-commercial fisheries, for example, some recreational fisheries in Pacific region and some Indigenous fisheries across Canada. Last year, I talked about DFO's intent to use a mosaic approach, reflecting the diverse operating conditions of our fisheries. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. This is still DFO's approach. Although that is easily said, more challenging is to collect and assess information to determine just how to bring new fishery practices appropriately into many and diverse fisheries. This diagram represents the scope of the whale safe gear strategy and the overall intent to expand the scope of whale safe gear work in Canadian fisheries. Currently, the focus has been on Eastern Canada, with existing measures in place to protect North Atlantic right whales, including dynamic closure protocols and augmented by the use of on-demand gear in closure areas. The species scope of the strategy reflects large whales, and that scope will expand to also focus on other baleen whale species besides right whales, with a focus on those species in Canadian waters for which entanglement has been identified as a threat. This includes species listed under the Species at Risk Act and also some species that are not listed. The strategy also recognizes the need to expand whale safe gear efforts to Western Canada, thus having an impact on additional fisheries and protecting additional whale species from entanglement. The temporal scope of the strategy is 5 years, though it will look beyond that. 5 years for now provides a reasonable time frame for identifying milestones and measuring progress on them. The strategy, as drafted now, has 5 proposed objectives. The 3 in the middle blocks in this diagram reflect a priority order, although activities supporting each objective will be happening concurrently. The first priority is to implement on-demand gear in areas most likely to prevent North Atlantic right whale entanglement. This is happening now to some extent and could expand. The second priority will be to expand the use of on-demand gear into fisheries more widely, in fisheries presenting a risk of entanglement for other whale species where on-demand gear suits the conditions of those fisheries. The third priority is to implement other kinds of gear modifications, such as lower breaking strength rope and other modifications where whale co-occurrence and entanglement risk may be lower than other areas, but there is still risk. This reflects that mosaic approach I mentioned. The arrows represent 2 other objectives of the strategy: entanglement risk assessments and research and gear trials, which will in turn contribute to the implementation of the other objectives in the longer term. As it's further developed, the strategy will identify specific activities and targets to advance these objectives. The current draft includes the following timelines as examples. By the end of 2025, a pilot area open only to on-demand gear will be established for North Atlantic right whales based on the best available science and looking at the highest risk fishing activity. A pilot area would be distinct from gear trials because it would involve DFO enforcement more actively to help support training and development of necessarily internal protocols, processes, management tools, and whatever is needed to support the wider use of on-demand gear. The strategy also proposes this target in support of that first objective. By the end of 2026, DFO will establish long-term, on-demand gear only whale protection areas where the highest threat of North Atlantic right whale entanglement has been identified, provided that gear trials and pilot areas demonstrate that the gear can be operated safely in the relevant fisheries. The location and size of these areas will be based on the best available science and will reflect co-occurrence, expertise from Indigenous and non-Indigenous harvesters, whale experts, and others. The intent is not for the strategy to lay out a specific plan for each individual fishery that will be affected. Considering all Canadian fixed gear fisheries, dozens of different fisheries are relevant to whale safe gear. Rather, the strategy will identify information needs and processes that can then be incorporated into existing management processes, ultimately reflected in management tools such as license conditions and individual fishery management plans. Making Canadian fisheries safer for whales will also bring benefits to the fishing industry and others. Current market pressures on Canadian fisheries, for example, from certification bodies and potentially from the US Marine Mammal Protection Act, are expected to be eased as more measures are adopted to reduce entanglement harm to whales. Also, we expect the increased use of whale-safe gear will protect species that are culturally important to Canadians and to support the recovery of species that are listed under Canada's Species at Risk Act. How will we know when we're making progress on this ambitious strategy? DFO will be looking at ways to measure the reduction in entanglement risk and also reduction in the incidence and severity of entanglements. This, of course, would be as part of the Right Whale Consortium community. DFO also will need to identify ways to measure the continued success and sustainability of fisheries as on-demand gear and gear modifications are adopted more widely. Over time, DFO will be committed to reporting on progress through various mechanisms, including web updates of the strategy, which will be an evergreen document, the continued publication of entanglement gear analyses, and ongoing engagement with industry experts and other groups. So as I mentioned earlier, in July, we distributed a proposed or draft strategy with the intent to receive written feedback and also to engage in in-person and virtual sessions, reaching out to Canadian partners, stakeholders, experts, etc. Those groups included fishing industry, whale experts, gear experts, First Nations and Indigenous groups, and other relevant partners and affected groups in Canada. Discussions with some of those affected groups or individuals and experts will help the department flesh out the details of a 5-year strategy to achieve the goals and objectives that I've mentioned here. We've received some written comments since July and expect to receive more in the next few weeks. And this fall, we're undertaking in-person engagement with fish harvesters and others around Atlantic Canada in person, and virtual sessions will be made available in Eastern Canada as well as in Pacific region. DFO has committed to finalizing the whale safe gear strategy in the winter of 2025. The department has a lot of internal work to do in parallel with activities that are being identified outside the department. We have a national working group in place with participants from across DFO's 4 management regions in Eastern Canada, as well as Pacific region in the West. We have representation from all relevant branches of the department, including science, conservation and protection, fisheries management, species at risk program, and others. Lastly, I would like to mention that some of my colleagues are planning the 2nd International Fishing Gear Innovation Summit next February in Moncton, New Brunswick, with a focus on ghost gear reduction and on whale-safe gear. We expect a draft agenda to be available fairly soon. You can contact myself or others at DFO for more information on that. Thank you.